You didn't ask for much. That's the part you remember most clearly. Not the anger, not the loss, the reasonableness. You calibrated. You read the room before speaking. You adjusted before anyone asked you to. You weighed the cost of what you wanted against the cost of wanting it out loud, and you made the only rational calculation available. You were not passive. You were not weak. You were not afraid of conflict in the way people mean when they say that. You were precise. You understood, earlier than most, that certain desires carry a tax, that certain requests change the temperature of a room, that certain versions of yourself make other people uncomfortable in ways that eventually become your problem. Not because you lacked courage, not because you didn't know what you wanted, not because someone explicitly told you to be smaller, because you learned, and learned correctly at the time, that being reasonable was the most efficient path through. This video will not tell you that you were wrong to do that. It will not offer you permission to stop. It will not give you a framework for finally asking for what you want. What it will do is show you the exact mechanism that made reasonableness feel like a choice when it was never entirely one, and what that mechanism has been quietly building in the background every year you've continued to run it. You didn't shrink. You optimized. The distinction is important, and also, it doesn't protect you from what that optimization costs over time. There's a version of this story that gets told as a character flaw. The person who doesn't advocate for themselves. The one who defers, accommodates, absorbs. Self-help calls it a lack of boundaries. Therapy calls it people-pleasing. The popular framework says you need to value yourself more, speak up more, take up more space. That framing is not wrong. It is structurally incomplete. It treats the behavior as a deficit, something missing that needs to be installed. More confidence, more self-worth, more willingness to be disliked. The actual mechanism runs in the opposite direction. Reasonableness, as a chronic operating mode, is not the absence of something. It is the presence of a highly functional system doing exactly what it was calibrated to do. The system doesn't misread the situation. It reads it perfectly. It assesses what is available, what is likely, what the cost of friction will be, and it produces the output with the highest probability of stability. It is not confused. It is not broken. It is running an optimization function that was built for a different set of conditions than the ones you currently live in. That is a precise and important difference. A person with a deficit needs something added. A person running an outdated optimization function needs something much harder. They need the system itself to update. Those are not the same process, and they do not respond to the same interventions. In the late 1960s, a psychologist named Martin Seligman ran a series of experiments on dogs that were later replicated in variations across multiple species, including humans. The setup was straightforward. Animals were exposed to mild electric shocks they could not escape. No lever, no exit, no action changed the outcome. Later, the conditions changed. An exit was made available. The shock became escapable. Most animals in the control group, animals who had never experienced the inescapable condition, immediately found the exit. The animals who had been through the first phase mostly did not. They lay down. They waited for the shock to pass. They had learned, at a level below conscious reasoning, that action and outcome were not connected. The information that conditions had changed did not update the behavior. The lesson from the inescapable phase remained active. Seligman called it learned helplessness. But that name focuses on the failure state. The more precise observation is this: the behavior in phase 2 was not a malfunction. It was a direct, accurate readout of what the system had learned. The system was working correctly. The system was simply solving a problem that no longer existed. There is a layer of this data that rarely gets mentioned in the popular version of this research. Hold that. It comes back later, and it changes what the experiment means. The brain structure centrally involved in this process is the anterior cingulate cortex. Its function, stripped of jargon, is to monitor the relationship between action and outcome. It tracks whether effort produces results. It adjusts motivational investment accordingly. It does not evaluate this philosophically. It runs continuous pattern recognition on your history of attempts, extended exposure to conditions where effort and outcome are disconnected, where the request doesn't change the answer, where the need expressed changes the room but not the outcome, where visibility costs more than invisibility. That exposure updates the anterior cingulate's model. The update is not conscious. It is architectural. The circuit that governs is action worth taking here recalibrates toward a default of low probability. Not because you've decided effort is pointless, because the system has accumulated enough evidence to treat low probability as the baseline. That recalibration is not a flaw in the architecture. It is the architecture performing exactly as designed. The brain is an efficiency engine. It does not keep investing motivational resources in patterns that have historically returned low yields. The problem is not that the system updated. The problem is the update doesn't expire automatically. It requires specific conditions to reverse. And those conditions are not finally being in a safe environment. Think about the first time you understood that a particular kind of want was expensive. Not the first time someone said no. That happens to everyone. The first time you registered, below reasoning, before you had language for it, that the wanting itself was the problem. That the expression of the need was what changed things. It may have been appetite. It may have been anger. It may have been enthusiasm that was too large for the room it was in. It may have been a version of yourself that was simply more than what the people around you knew how to hold. You didn't make a decision in that moment. The system made a calculation. What is the cost of visibility here? What is the cost of need here? What is the available yield on expression here? The calculation ran. The answer came back. The behavior adjusted accordingly. You were not old enough to question the conditions. You were not in a position to evaluate whether the sample size was representative. You were learning the physics of your specific environment, and you learned them accurately. Ask yourself what version of yourself you stopped performing first, not gradually, the first clear contraction. Ask yourself what the room felt like when you were too much in it. Ask yourself how quickly the adjustment happened, and how permanently. Here's the part that is the most difficult to hold in both hands at once. That system was not a mistake. The child who learned to calibrate expression, to read the room before speaking, to want quietly, to need in ways that didn't cost others too much. That child was solving a real problem. The optimization was intelligent. The reasonableness was not passivity. It was the most efficient available adaptation to conditions that were genuinely non-negotiable. The brain does not produce pathology. It produces solutions. Some solutions outlive the problem that generated them. The complication arrives here. Knowing that the original calibration was adaptive does not update the circuit. Insight is not a system update. Understanding the origin of a behavioral pattern and being free of it are not the same event, and they do not occur on the same timeline. The system that learned to want quietly is still running in environments where wanting loudly is entirely available. not because you haven't understood yourself, because the architecture predates your understanding. It does not consult your current reasoning before producing its output. You can hold both of these things simultaneously. The adaptation was legitimate. The adaptation is still limiting you. Neither cancels the other. There is a specific finding from Seligman's later research that almost never enters the popular version of this story. The animals that did not escape, even once the exit was available, were not uniformly unable to learn that conditions had changed. A subset of them were physically moved through the escape, repeatedly. Their bodies were guided through the action that they were no longer initiating on their own. The successful escape had to be externally produced multiple times before the anterior cingulate registered it as real data. The insight that conditions had changed, that the exit existed, was not sufficient. The system required evidence in the form of completed action, not described action, not observed action, executed action that registered as actual outcome. This is the part that most interventions built around learned helplessness miss entirely. The update pathway is not cognitive. It is behavioral and incremental, and it requires a specific kind of evidence that purely mental revision cannot produce. The implications of this, for every self-help framework built on insight, understanding, and self-awareness, are difficult to overstate. Willpower says, want the thing hard enough, and the hesitation will collapse. The anterior cingulate does not respond to want, it responds to action outcome evidence. Wanting more does not update the pattern. It adds motivational pressure to a system that is not running a want deficit. Discipline says, build the habit, remove the need for decision. Habits are downstream of motivational circuits, a system that has learned to discount the available yield on expression does not become more expressive through repetition of small actions. The small action does not transfer to the constrained behavior. It runs on a parallel track. Accountability says, tell someone, create external pressure, make failure costly. The system that was calibrated in environments where visibility was costly does not recalibrate toward visibility because visibility has been made structurally necessary. It finds the minimum viable version of compliance. It does the expressible version. It leaves the actual want in the same position it was already in. The question is not, how do I become less reasonable? The question is, what kind of evidence produced in what sequence and at what scale is sufficient to update a circuit that has been running this pattern for decades? That is a different problem. It does not have a quick answer. It barely has a slow one. You know the moment. It is not the moment of refusal. Refusal comes later, if it comes at all. It is the moment before you are about to ask, about to say the thing, about to take up the space the situation is technically offering you, and something runs, not thought, not decision, a fast, subconscious evaluation. Is it worth it? Is this the moment? Is what you want worth the cost of wanting it here? The evaluation completes in under a second. You say something smaller, or you say nothing, or you say the reasonable version, the one that can survive the temperature of the room. This is not you being afraid. This is not you lacking self-worth. This is not a moral failing. The circuit ran. It produced its default output. You experienced it as hesitation. It was not hesitation. It was the system running exactly the pattern it was built to run in a context that did not build it, toward an outcome that is no longer what you're optimizing for. The mechanism does not know that. What chronic reasonableness builds over years is not catastrophe. It builds a narrowing. The range of situations in which you allow yourself to be fully present contracts. The requests you permit yourself to make reduce to the ones with pre-confirmed answers. The opportunities you pursue become the ones that do not require you to be too visible in the wanting of them. You stop standing in front of certain doors, not because you decided they were closed, because the calculation runs before you reach them, and the output comes back low probability, and you redirect before the door is ever actually tested. The life that gets built this way looks, from the outside, considered, strategic, mature. From the inside, it is the accumulated residue of 10,000 calculations, each individually reasonable, collectively drawing a smaller and smaller circle. You did not choose the size of the circle. The system drew it. Here's what rarely gets stated plainly. The nervous system that learned to optimize for stability does not only run the calibration in the original domain, it generalizes. The pattern that was learned in one kind of room gets applied to rooms with different physics. The update that was accurate in a childhood environment with genuinely limited options transfers, without consent, without evaluation, without a check on whether the new environment actually warrants it. The research on this is consistent. Generalization is not a bug. It is one of the core functions of the pattern recognition architecture. It means that being in a safer environment now is a necessary condition for the system to update, but it is not a sufficient one, and the timeline for the update, even under the right conditions, even with the right kind of behavioral evidence, is not the timeline that insight promises. It is slower, it is nonlinear. It does not correlate cleanly with how clearly you understand the mechanism. You can understand everything in this video precisely. The pattern will still run tomorrow morning. That is not pessimism. It is a description of how long systems take to revise. You were not wrong to be reasonable. The calculation was correct for the conditions it was built in. That is the part that stays, regardless of where this understanding goes from here. The circuit still runs. The room has changed. The circuit does not know that yet. Reasonable is what you learned. It is not what you are. The pattern that kept you invisible also kept you intact. There is a related mechanism, quieter, more defended, almost never identified directly. Some of the options you've redirected from were not low probability. They were genuinely available. The system found another reason not to move toward them. Not because success was impossible, because success required you to become someone the current architecture was not built to sustain. That is a different kind of cost, and a different kind of protection. If that circuit is running in you, watch the next video.